and it's more than a pleasure to have him with us. I have a lot of respect for the Urban Institute and for Jim, and also for somebody he wrote an article with, Mark Zandi, who I'll get a lot of my, number crunching stuff from at Moody Analytics. Jim and Mark wrote a great piece in the Washington Post, and we're so excited that he could be with us today on the heels of the Democratic Convention and on the heels of currently Vice President Harris and the Democratic nominee for President Harris and what they have to say on trying to make housing more affordable and trying to solve this crisis, which it truly is a housing crisis for so many in our nation, and certainly has been even worse since COVID in 2020. Jim Parrott, thank you for joining us. Jim, Mr. Parrott, which do you prefer?
Oh, Jim's fine. Thank you a ton for having me.
Thank you for being here. Jim, there are people out there on the right that are, I always say that when a Democrat speaks as a Democrat, Republicans going to, if Kamala Harris walked on water, Obama, Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, they would, say it was low tide, very low tide, right? They're always going to come up with something. One of the things Kamala Harris speaks about is her upbringing and the struggles her own family had. And I grew up in a household where my mother had to use food stamps sometimes. My father was very ill. Thank God for veterans benefits. My father fought in the Korean War, or we wouldn't have made it. We wouldn't have been able to stare a little cheap house that we had. These are the true kitchen table issues. Housing, right? How can I afford rent? How could I ever afford the American dream to buy a house? And I really know what she's speaking of because she comes from the state I live in right now, California. Northern California, incredibly expensive. Here in LA, where I live, incredibly expensive. And there are so many people poo-pooing her plan. So I'm glad to have you with us to break it down. Is there actually a possibility through legislation, through a political figure like Vice President Harris, to solve the long-time housing crisis, to make housing more affordable?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, it depends almost entirely on whether or not we have a functional Congress come next year, because this would have to go through them. But I think if a Harris administration is willing to lead on this, and every indication is that she is, she's made it a priority early on in her campaign. Friday she gave a big speech in which this was the centerpiece. She mentioned it again last night. Not surprisingly, you heard President Obama mention it in his speech, President Biden mentioned it in his speech, even President Clinton mentioned it in his speech. So it feels to me like this is going to be a high priority issue for these guys. If it is, and she gets a Congress that is willing to do more, than raise the debt ceiling or a couple of other minimal things, then I think the demand across constituencies all across the country, all 50 states face this problem, is going to make it really hard for folks in Congress not to take this up as an issue. And as we write about in that piece, the way to solve it is likely on the tax side. That is, you're likely going to solve it by changing the economics for builders to want to build the sort of stuff that we actually need. And last I heard, Republicans tend to like tax cuts, and that's functionally what this would be for builders. So it feels like the Venn diagram might actually come together here, where you've got a progressive that wants to push a pretty important progressive objective, and she wants to push it in a way that just happens to align pretty well with what Republicans tend to want. And then when Republicans go home to their districts, they hear, I assume, over and over again, that this is an issue. So it feels like the pieces may come together here next year if we've got a functional Congress.
I had mentioned that you co-wrote with Moody Analytics chief economist Mark Zandi a piece, and I forgot to mention it was in the Washington Post. It was an op-ed, an opinion piece entitled "Harris Plan Could Solve the Longtime Affordable Housing Crisis." In your piece, you break down some numbers, and because I'm not a numbers person, and I think a lot of people need to see, well, what are you talking about since the pandemic hit, that things have been, worse or more painful or higher? And, you write that rents are up about 20%, forcing half of all renters to spend more than 30% of their monthly income on rent. Now, we know that's not living in your means, within your means, right? They always say it should be less than that to live within your means. And you also point out that's the highest number on record. Home prices up 50%, mortgage rates up almost 100%. And then you look at the numbers and you write that a monthly payment for a median priced house has more than doubled from 1,000 to 2,250, a home that was affordable a few years ago, well out of reach. And for people like me that went, how much can I get for my house? Oh, but how much would I have to pay to move, unless you're downsizing greatly or moving to a different state? So let me ask you this. My best friend lives in London. And in the UK, specifically London, they do something. And I was wondering if it would be possible here, and if it would be helpful here, and if the government could, because to me, this is a way they could do it. In London, they were building this building right close to my best friend's home. And I said, oh, that's really nice. And then she said, yeah. And I said, how come the back is different than the front, the balconies and things like that? And then she said, oh, and she goes, well, and she goes, for you, Leslie, American would be that's like, I don't want to say Section 8, but more affordable housing. And what it is every builder, whatever building they have, there's a certain percentage that have to be affordable units. And of course, they don't put in the highest end. They're not putting in the sub-zero fridge in that kitchen and things like that. Is that something that could work here? Or, dare I reflect on London and the UK? Because, of course, I'm going to be called a socialist in 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, well, you will be called that for this, but it is something we not only can we do here, we actually do it now. So that happens in two ways. At the local level, oftentimes developers come into a community and want to, put up a 6-story building or whatnot in an area where there aren't 6-story buildings. The town council is reticent about allowing it to happen, and they negotiate effectively what the builder's got to do to get to yes in that development. And oftentimes, this is true in the community I live in. I live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and what the town council will demand is that the builder sets aside, X% of the units to be affordable by some metric in order to get a green light. That happens pretty frequently at a local level. It's not nearly used as aggressively as it probably could or should be. At the federal level, the main tax credit program for affordable rental housing, which is called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, is effectively that kind of model, which is if you get a tax credit like this, you've got to commit to setting aside a certain percentage of the units in your newly developed rental building to be for affordable housing. So that's kind of the way it works. So the builder wants to do it because they get to fill most of their building up with market rate rent, which is where they make their profit. And communities like it because they end up getting a whole bunch of affordable units they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And actually what Harris does in her proposal is she recommends almost doubling that program on the rental side to make it more muscular and make it lead to more affordable housing. And Mark Zandi and I estimate that if you were to change the strength of that program in the way she's suggesting, it would lead to over 1 million new affordable rental units over the next 5 years. So it's a pretty important piece of the puzzle. So you're not wrong to think that we ought to do more of that here, because we should.
People don't realize, I think, that, when you talk about strain, people think about strain on the families with this, but it significantly damages the economy, as you write. Can you explain to people how it damages the economy when you have the strain on families, specifically with housing?
Yeah, so people tend to forget that housing is the biggest asset most folks own and the biggest debt through their mortgage most folks carry. And so the size of that asset, the size of that debt really affects families pretty significantly. It can affect people in a positive way, where if you get into a house that you can afford and you begin to pay your monthly payments over time, it is the main way the middle class has grown wealth for generations. And so it is, in a positive way, one of the most significant sort of wealth accelerants we have in the country. So that's the way it has an effect in a positive tailwind sort of way. As a headwind, if you're having renters pay over a third of their income monthly payments in, or revenue, I should say, profits, whatever they make towards housing, there's not much left to save.
Hold that thought, and we'll talk about what that does, because I would imagine that has a trickle-down effect on other areas of expenses that homeowners or renters have. We'll be back with Jim Parrott from the Urban Institute right after this. And we're back. I'm Leslie Marshall. We are me, your host, and our guest, Jim Parrott. He is a non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute. Check out their website. A lot of good stuff there. urban.org. Jim wrote, along with Moody Analytics chief economist Mark Zandi, a great op-ed in the Washington Post titled "Harris Plan Could Solve the Longtime Affordable Housing Crisis." We're talking about how that cause of the rising housing prices, whether it's rent or it's mortgage, not only is an issue with families and puts a strain on those families financially, but also on our economy. Jim, thank you for holding. Welcome back. Please continue.
Yeah, sure. So the way to think about it is if you've got extremely high housing costs, whether it's rent or cost towards your mortgage, families are unable to save much, if any, money. They end up spending almost the entirety of their monthly wages on expenses, including housing. So they're not able to save for their kids' college education. They're not able to save for a down payment for a house if they're renters. And so it really does hold back their growth economically. And that in turn holds back broader growth economy-wide. And then at a sort of company community level, it really impedes mobility. So if you're in a house that you can afford now and you're looking to move towards a job, towards opportunity, and you can't afford a place to live near that better job, that better opportunity, the better schools for your kids, then you end up locked into place. And that lack of labor mobility comes at a real cost to the nation's GDP, to economic growth generally. And so one of the biggest proponents of supply side measures like this tends to be the Chamber of Commerce and local development focused businesses, because they struggle to find folks to come in and fill their factories, to fill their management teams, because there's not enough housing. So it really does hold back not just family economic growth, but communities' economic growth and national economic growth as well.
And when you talk about, growth, I mean, there's a dirty word out there. Despite the economy improving, inflation is something that, terrifies people. And you write that if not for the ever increasing cost of housing, inflation would have returned to the Federal Reserve's target almost a year ago. We're hearing rumblings from Jerome Powell that the interest rates, that inflation is going to, drop rates. But I don't think we're going to have them drop to where we were almost a year ago, and we still have the, housing crisis.
Yeah, it's enormously frustrating because the last price in the index the Fed uses to determine whether they're at the right rate, the last price to come down is the cost of shelter. So everything else was on a downward trajectory beginning quite some time ago. Housing, rent, and the cost of home ownership was still going up. And so that's what's effectively kept us in this painful holding pattern with the Fed now for much longer than it would have been otherwise. And somewhat ironically, it's actually made the cost of housing go up because interest rates being high obviously makes your mortgage rate higher. And interest rates being high also means that it's more expensive for builders to build, which means they're not building enough, which makes the supply shortage worse, which makes home prices higher than they should be. So the Fed's last piece of the puzzle in housing, keeping interest rates high to deal with inflation, actually made that one piece of the index worse, not better. So it's been a problem for the Fed and for policymakers now for quite some time.
You talk about the burden, right, on homeowners, and I always think it's almost like it's a catch-22, a dog chasing their tail. It's like I can't afford a house, and I don't have enough money left over to save for the down payment to get a house, even when the rates drop. And if you're looking
Yep.
at housing in places like I live, I mean, you're talking $1 million for like, a 2 bedroom, 1 bath home in some areas. And no joke. I mean, there people call $1 million house a tear down, around here. So how with inflation dropping, the economy improving, and then the proposals coming out of the Harris Walls ticket for the future, do you see any hope on the horizon with the marriage, if you will, of all three?
Yeah, I'm honestly hopeful because this has been an issue now for several years. I mean, the supply shortage goes back almost a decade coming out of the financial crisis. So it's been an issue for quite some time, but it has gotten more political coverage, more political focus in the last 2 months than it's gotten in the last 20 years. I mean, I can't recall as much attention given to this issue as we've seen recently. And so I'm mildly optimistic that the combination of that, the degree to which there is frustration turning somewhat to anger in blue states, red states, blue congressional districts, red congressional districts, that'll make this a less partisan issue as we wrestle with it. I just think it's really hard for them not to tackle this at some point, which means that, once we get a functional Congress, that's obviously an enormous conditional, but once we get a functional Congress, just feels to me like this has got to be a really high priority for them. It's hard for me to imagine constituencies sitting by and letting all this float in this pretty untenable way much longer.
And you're right. The cause of the rising cost of housing is not a mystery. We simply don't have enough affordable homes for rent or for sale, and we know the reason for that: greed, right? The profit margin. It's off the charts. Is it fair when people get angry? I'm going to take my state, and people say, "Well, Gavin Newsom is not making our housing affordable." Is it fair, or is it difficult because housing is in the private sector, and unless certain legislation is passed, not just on a state level, but even a federal level, some politicians' hands, regardless of their political party, are tied, when it comes to prices. I mean, we don't want the government, setting the prices. I mean, it's funny. You got people on the right saying the government needs to do more. And it's like, well, the government set the prices. That would be socialism.
Yeah, so it is an immensely complicated challenge because you've got the cost of materials has been through the roof, labor costs has been through the roof. There are all of these costs that go into building a home, that many of which are largely out of control of policymakers. There's a fair amount that can be done at a local level with zoning decisions. That's not a Gavin Newsom question. That's a mayor so-and-so question. And to date, it's been politically unpopular in most communities to allow density in the areas where you need it to make all this work. So in some senses, the state's not always very well equipped to manage it. The mayor is pretty well equipped, and Congress is well equipped to change the math, of the tax code, but states are often not all that well equipped to deal with it. So you need stuff at the micro level, at the town council level, and then if you can get it, you need stuff at the congressional level to change the math for builders. But to come back to what you said about greed being the problem, what we need to do is marshal that and turn it into a tool rather than an impediment. We need to take advantage of the fact that builders are out to make a dollar like a lot of other folks are, and you need to make the dollars work for them so that they'll take their bazooka of profit seeking and turn it from the top of the market where it's focused now to the bottom of the market where we actually need them to put up houses. So take advantage of that profit seeking sensibility because we need it right now.
I'm going to tell you something because it reminded me of what you wrote, and applying it to my own life, if you will. I had this store that I liked in the town I live here in Southern California. And I went, and it said we're closing. And I went in and I asked the manager, who I knew because I shopped there a lot, why are you closing? And she said, the rent's going up so high. So then it was literally empty for a year and a half. And this was not after or during COVID. This was before 2020. And there is a real estate company that I see with all these commercial properties, their name in the window. And I actually called the real estate company and I said, why would you raise the rent on this, company? Because I loved it. And now I have to schlep really far to go to it, right? Completely selfish, reasons. They've been empty a year and a half. And they said a couple of months of the rent increase makes up for that. Okay. So the reason I say that is, to your point, why aren't the builders building more affordable housing? Money is money, because the money doesn't add up, right? If they sell one, and yes, anybody can watch House Hunters, Millionaires, Beverly Hills, or whatever, you sell one $27 million home, and that's a huge markup because it didn't cost $27 million to build, and the land didn't cost $27 million, right? You build one house and you're going to make a huge profit. They're going to make more off that than building maybe 50 or 100, lower income houses. And that's why they do it. So you say the solution is to change the economics, and going back to what you said at the onset of this hour, that's at the heart of the housing proposal that was released by Vice President Harris. laying out that set of tax breaks you spoke of, in which the numbers for building affordable housing would pencil out. So we're going to take a break. We're going to come back. And when we come back, we're going to talk about this. Obviously, this is the end. This is the end now. Okay. The bottom line here, let me give you the last 30 seconds. We got to incentivize, and we can do that through legislation, and everybody wins. So why isn't everybody on board with this?
Absolutely right. Well, they're not on board because it's an election year. So once we clear our throats politically and get past the election, my sense is next year folks will come around to it because it makes so much sense. Right now, it doesn't make any economic sense to build at the bottom of the market. With these changes, it would make economic sense. And so we'd see a ton of it built there, and that's what we need.
You're awesome. Jim Parrott, check out his great piece with Moody Analytics Chief Economist Mark Zandi. The Washington Post Harris Plan could solve the long-time affordable housing crisis. Also, check out the Urban Institute. Go to urban.org. You were great, Jim. I'd love to have you back another time. This hour just flew by, and I hope that our listeners and viewers learned a lot. I know I did. Thank you.
Thanks so much.